Hi, it's Uncle Larry. Today I want to focus on the idea that religious faith and social justice activism share many of the same characteristics. I want to be clear up front. Making this connection is not to say there's something wrong with having a faith or with being an activist, just that there are undeniable similarities. That's my main point today. And I'm in a good position to comment on this awkward subject because of my own background as both a former minister and an activist. Now, before I even get started, I know that there are social justice activists who will be uncomfortable with the idea of having their activism compared to religious faith, and vice versa. For both, it will seem unworthy, sort of like a step down, if you will, but it isn't. For example, an anthropologist encountering woke culture for the first time, imagine that. It would see it as indistinguishable from religious fundamentalism. It's true. Just hear me out. As a young man, having completed theological training and having decided to leave the ministry, I re-entered university and at first started studying the sociology of social conflict. The classes I took focused on Marxist social conflict theory with a focus on class divisions, which was a quite popular subject for those interested in social justice in the early 1980s. The zeal with which this subject matter was being taught by professors and lecturers was almost evangelistic, and the enthusiasm for it expressed by my young fellow students began to make me feel unsettled, sort of like I've been here before. To someone like me who hailed from a evangelical Christian background, something felt too familiar. A lot of things felt familiar. And again, I'm not making a value judgment here. I am just saying I was almost instantly making connections with what I had just transitioned from. Now, as the decades have marched along, the class-based approach to social justice has gradually been displaced by the politics of identity. Hardly anybody talks about economic class and the working poor anymore, like they did in my old sociology courses. Now it's all about being woke to the oppression associated with one's race, sex, gender, and other marginalized identity categories. It's still about equality, but now it's divided between oppressors and the oppressed, and so-called white privilege is now original sin. Note the religious parallel. The zeal for this fairly recent approach to social justice activism is much the same as the old class-based version, and both remain eerily familiar to the fervor of my religious upbringing. After doing some reading, I realized that I was not alone in making this connection. I was surprised. In a 2019 essay, The Righteous and the Woke, psychologist Valerie Terrico, a former evangelical, highlights similarities between evangelicals and woke ideology. She argues that both belief systems exhibit traits such as dogmatism, moral absolutism, an us versus them mentality, and intolerance toward dissenting views. Plus, both approaches can foster a sense of moral superiority among adherents and prioritize group identity over individual autonomy. So she's one example. Then I ran across John McWhorter, who is a linguist from Columbia University. He puts the connection this way: a religious framework is the only way a lot of wokeness makes sense. It's a framework that includes a fierce commitment that relegates logic and facts to the background, a framework that includes chasing heretics, a framework that sees white privilege as original sin, a framework that disallows questions that aren't permitted to be asked. All of this falls out naturally from seeing the woke movement within a religious framework. Now, for purposes of comparison, let's draw out some of these parallels by citing 9 quick extreme examples. By the way, this may or may not include everyone who identifies as woke or as religious, okay? But let's just go through these points. Number 1, under the heading of dogmatic beliefs, both being woke and especially religious fundamentalism often involve rigid adherence to certain perspectives that leave little room for questioning or nuance. Number 2, both concepts can foster a strong sense of group identity, where individuals may feel a sense of belonging and validation within their respective communities. Number 3, There's often a sense of moral superiority attached to being woke or adhering to religious beliefs, where adherents believe they have a monopoly on truth, even absolute truth, and righteousness. There's only one way of salvation, for example. Number 4, both can involve social pressure to conform to certain beliefs or behaviors, and the heretics who deviate may face shaming and ostracism from the community. Number 5, both concepts can foster an us versus them mentality, where those outside the group are seen as ignorant, wrong, or evil. For the religious, it might be sinners. For the woke, quite often it's the white working class that for some reason is a particular target of vitriol, and it really, really upsets me. Number 6, both can exhibit intolerance towards dissenting views, labeling them as ignorant, sinister, and will resort to silencing or attacking opposing perspectives. You must conform or we will cancel you. We will ruin you. We will deplatform you. You get the picture. Number 7, while religious commitments often revolve around sacred texts, being woke can center on specific narratives that are considered sacrosanct and beyond question. Number 8, both are evangelistic, actively seeking to recruit new adherents and convert others to their way of thinking, sometimes through persuasion, but more often than not, through coercion. Number 9, insider jargon. Now, for this point, I want to go back to Valerie Terrico's discussion of this subject in a section she wrote about insider language. She says, like many other groups, the religious and the woke signal insider status by using special language. An evangelical immediately recognizes a fellow member when he or she hears phrases like saved, backsliding, lost, stumbling block, giving your testimony, reaping a harvest of souls, etc. The woke signal their wokeness with expressions too. They have their own language like intersectionality, cultural appropriation, trigger warnings, microaggressions, privilege, fragility, problematic, or decolonization. In both cases, jargon isn't merely a tool for efficient or precise communication, as it is in many professions. It is a sign of belonging, a sign of your moral virtue. Now, these 9 parallels, and there may be more, highlight dichotomous thinking. On this account, you're either saved or damned. You are either woke or a bigot. On both counts, anyone who isn't completely all in is morally suspect. Through this lens of dichotomizing everything, we come to be seen first and foremost not as a multifaceted, complicated individual, but as a member of a group. You must check an identity box. That's what you are. Well, I don't know about you, but nobody's going to confine me to any box. I remember the day I decided to leave the ministry. It was early one Sunday morning prior to the main service, when I was speaking to some church members about some challenging times that I was facing. In an offhand comment, I said that as a young man, I was beginning to realize that not everything we experience in this life is black and white. Maturity involves accepting that there are going to be some gray areas. Well, sitting in the audience was the regional superintendent for our denomination. He was slated to be the guest speaker, the preacher, at the morning service, which immediately followed my remarks to my little class. So when the service arrived, I was sitting on the platform when this dignitary rose to speak. He marched to the pulpit, slammed his fist on it, and declared, "There are no gray areas. It is black and white. You're either saved or you're lost. You're either going to heaven or you're going to hell. You're either redeemed or you're condemned. No gray areas." Well, I sat there red-faced and realized that at that moment I was done. And the irony was I still believed. You could say I still do, but I don't believe that way. Not like that. Not anymore. But that's not good enough. The words of that superintendent sealed my fate. I had been canceled. In conclusion, there's nothing wrong with having a passion for social justice or having religious commitments, but you'll never convince me that there aren't parallels between social justice activism and religious belief. John McWhorter is right. A religious framework is the only way a lot of wokeness makes any sense at all. Now, I say we progressives can do better than this. Whether we are, number one, Christian progressives, yes, there are Christian progressives, including evangelical progressives, or two, adherents of old class conflict theory, or three, whether we lean toward wokeness, what we need, all of us, is a revitalized, tough center to oppose the toxic, destructive extremes in our respective movements whenever they appear. We need to speak up, and we need to stick up for each other. Without that, we will continue to be hijacked by rigid catechisms, woke and religious, and reasonable people will remain on the sidelines.